Today will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Happy birthday to my home and native land. May you last another quarter millennium, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Lindy effect would predict you will, so we'll see. And I was thinking about, I knew this was coming up, what would be the most American video I could make. And I could make a video about how I think soccer is dumb, although I still have a favorite soccer team and why. I could make a video about why I hate the metric system because I understand it. But those are kind of minor things. Like, I don't think about soccer unless, like, the World Cup is forcing me to notice it's happening, right? And the metric system is, I don't like it, but it's not, like, top of my priorities. And none of them involve books. And also, they're both things, the metric system and soccer are both newer than the United States, so they're not, like, foundational. So the obvious thing, pretty much from when I started thinking about it, was making a video defending the specifically American conception of freedom of speech, which pretty much uniquely in the Western world rejects the idea of exceptions for hate speech. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to try to not be polemical because I try not to be. And so I actually want to start by acknowledging that often the people who will defend this will be libertarians who will sort of not acknowledge the things I want to acknowledge. And I'm libertarianish. But anyways, so first of all, so the US has several exceptions, carve-outs to free speech, only 3 of which are potentially relevant to most people. So there's defamation, which really is only relevant if you get hit with a SLAPP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And that's really an issue more with the US court systems, because actual US defamation law, like, it's going to be very hard to actually get convicted of defamation, but someone can sue you for it and it provides a pretext. And a lot of states have anti-SLAPP suits. Texas actually has a pretty good one, but it still is an obstacle issue if you hit it. And then commercial speech, the government can regulate much more heavily. And so if you're doing anything commercial, you have to worry about this to some degree. But it also tends to be fairly minor and predictable what would actually get you in trouble. The big one, the big issue, is copyright, which started as you would register for 14 years and you could renew for another 14 years. And it has become now, it's automatic registration. It lasts 70 years after your death, or if it's a corporate work, 95 years. And it's asymmetrical because you have to, if you think it's $80 to register, and if you don't do that before someone infringes, even if they keep infringing, you can only get actual damages, which are generally small. You can't even get lawyers' fees. And so it's very much set up at this point to favor copyright protection for big corporations, and the rest of us are basically relying on other factors. And I won't really get into copyright too much, but I want to acknowledge that this is probably the biggest obstacle for Americans, and probably for Europeans too, even bigger than hate speech. And also that theoretically, if you had European countries that had better, and so like Sweden used to not criminalize contributory infringement, which I don't know how much that matters, but it certainly is better than the US, and of course the Pirate Bay thing changed that. And France has explicit exceptions for stuff like parody that's clearer than the fair use. But France also is worse than the US on a lot of copyright issues. And so you could theoretically, just by having better copyright laws, be more free than the US, I would say, in terms of free speech, even without the hate speech issue. And of course, copyright is the thing that gets YouTubers into trouble. And that actually gets into the next thing, which is the biggest obstacle, I think, for Americans, and probably Europeans too, with free speech, is just the corporate monopoly control over these platforms, which will surprise people when I say it, because, again, libertarianish, and they're like, wait, I wouldn't think you would want the government to regulate these platforms. And I'm like, I don't, but I can still acknowledge it's a problem. Like, not every problem has a solution, or a solution that's going to be better than the original problem. And it is also the case that, like with YouTube specifically, the reason YouTube has a monopoly is because of the copyright stuff. Like, YouTube was sued for copyright infringement, Google bought it, had deep pockets. I think Blip.tv went out of business because they were sued for copyright infringement, and that's a big factor in why we don't see competitors to YouTube. Although it's not the only factor. Like, Cloudflare basically has a monopoly on distributed denial of service, DDoS attacks. And if Cloudflare drops you, then you are kind of screwed if you have any sort of prominence. But it is a factor anyways. And so anyways, with all that acknowledged, I also want to acknowledge I'm not going to really try to steelman the other side, because I want to, not trying to be polemical, but I also want to try to keep this short. And I'm not convinced I could steelman the argument like well enough that it wouldn't come across as a straw man. So I want to acknowledge that the idea behind hate speech laws in theory is that it is protecting sort of marginalized, disadvantaged groups from either feeling unsafe from what people are saying or from actually creating a culture of discrimination are sort of the two big, broad arguments for it. And with that in mind, like, I wanted to, if I had more time, I would have read Milton and Paine and other people on free speech, but I didn't have unlimited time, and I sort of, well, most of the people I'm going to reference, actually, I just happened to, or half of them anyways, I happened to read, and I was like, this would be good for the video, and then a couple of them I went looking, and they're all more modern, and they're all at the point where they can acknowledge that in sort of a little before to after World War II, you started to have this idea that we should have restrictions on free speech in the public good. But rather than the old idea of it was to protect community norms, there's no such thing as community, it's to protect individuals in groups. Anyways, so these more modern writers are probably more relevant anyways. And I'm also going to talk about a couple of Catholic, like, people who would be considered far right, one of whom explicitly, one kind of implicitly defended censorship. And that would include hate speech on the sort of community norms, community cohesion ground, which admittedly I'm doing that because I feel like the way they defend it actually sort of gets to my biggest issue with hate speech restrictions. But so before I get into that, actually, I want to acknowledge there are three arguments that I would have used that I now think one of them is inherently bad. It's been kind of discredited. And then two of them they're kind of begging the question, and I will address the underlying issue. But the way that I would use them, and I've seen a lot of defenders of the American conception of free speech use them, they are not good arguments. They're not really going to be convincing. And so the first argument that I think doesn't apply anymore is that when you're giving the government this power to regulate the content of what people are saying based on discrimination, that opens the door for someone to just flip it and be like, okay, actually, we're not going to prosecute hate speech against black people, but we'll just prosecute hate speech against white people. And well, the US doesn't have hate speech laws, but we have anti-discrimination laws. And Trump tried that in his first term, and the bureaucracy stonewalled, people sued, and then second term, it seems like he's basically given it up. And so that sort of shows that the bureaucracy that is charged with enforcing this, as long as the ideology is that it should go one way, that argument doesn't really hold water at all. And then the other two arguments, so one of them is, and this is sort of the classic, US speech protections are supposed to be only based on time, place, and manner and not content, because you don't want the government deciding that. And for me, like, distrusting the government, that one's pretty obvious. But if you have more trust in the government or think the government can be fixed, then it's not really obvious, and it sort of begs the question, well, why should it, like, inherently, why should you want to draw that distinction? And then the next issue that I don't think is compelling anymore is that enforcement of anti-hate speech laws will often crack down on saying things that are verifiably, factually true. And of course, they're the kind of things where I've seen enough people get in trouble with YouTube. I'm not going to repeat them, even to disagree with them, unfortunately. But you probably know which examples I'm talking about, and they come with implicit assumptions. Like, when you hear people saying these things, you know that there's other things that they want to say about what we should do with that information. And I've said before, no set of facts can actually determine anything about what you should do. Your interpretation is based on the frameworks you're using, but the people using them know that they are using certain frameworks, and the people they're talking to are likely to use similar frameworks where they'll hear similar things. And so without having the freedom to actually say what they are implying, say the quiet part out loud, right? Without the freedom to say things that are factually probable or possible, but not verifiably clearly true, without the possibility of expressing opinions and frameworks, you don't really have the freedom, even if we could agree on what is going to be factually true, which, again, who gets to determine that? I've talked about how a lot of debunking is just, well, the various experts agree that this interpretation is wrong when there's a pretty good reason for it. So you actually need to have freedom to actually say something. You need to not just be able to express things that are verifiably true, but also possibly true based on evidence and opinions and all of that together. And then it also just begs the question of, well, why should speech be protected simply because it's true, which might seem obvious to some of you, but I don't think is as obvious. I don't think people actually operate that way. And then there was actually one more argument that I would not have taken too seriously recently, but I'm taking more seriously now. But it's still not necessarily going to be convincing, which is that hate speech restrictions are inherently asymmetrical. I have seen, like, when I see people who would be associated with the political left get censored, it's because of usually copyright stuff. And when it's not, it's for promotion of violence. Whereas people on the political right are generally targets of hate speech. And in fact, often what is considered the political right is defined by whether it's considered hate speech. And so you have these gender-critical radical feminists whose whole worldview is based on the assumption that the biggest problem in the world is the male propensity for violence. So you would think should be associated with the left, but because they classify trans women as male and trans men as female, they are grouped onto the political right. Or likewise, a lot of critics of Islam who would identify as liberal get grouped onto the political right because that is seen as Islamophobic hate speech. And I wouldn't have necessarily agreed with the argument, okay, well, these views should be assigned to the dustbin of history. I think nothing can ever be assigned to the dustbin of history, and if you can't have people articulating it, you're going to have people starting to reinvent it and sort of quietly repeat it. I don't really believe in the notion of progress and haven't for a while. I think it's largely illusory. But for people who believe in progress, they're like, okay, well, these views have been discredited. They're consigned to the dustbin of history, so why should we allow that discussion? Like, it's asymmetric because they're wrong and they've been discredited, which I think the big issue here is that it does what Nassim Nicholas calls fragilization, when you are cutting out like a big part of the discourse, which actually is part of my broader issue in general. However, I also recognize that that is now more compelling to me, but it's not necessarily compelling to the kind of people raising this argument. And so I've been trying to read, understand, like, conservatives and the right in general better. And I've been starting to read thinkers who identify as reactionary. And one of the more interesting here is this blogger Bonald, who is like a Catholic integralist guy. And he has a bunch of essays called In Defense. I haven't read all of them, but I have read In Defense of Censorship. And basically his argument is that censorship is needed in order to protect the legitimacy of the regime. You need to exclude people from discussing certain thoughts, at least publicly, to avoid undermining faith in the regime. And he defends it as like the Catholic order, but he's also like, I'm not going to call these people on the left who defend hate speech restrictions and stuff like that hypocrites, because their order, their foundational mythology, is also based on stuff that needs to be protected. It's just inherent to power. And I think that is true, and I'm going to come back to that. But I also think it's interesting that it's a specifically Catholic position. And there's another thinker who I actually read after reading Hannah Arendt, which is sort of ironic, although probably not as ironic as Arendt being a student of Heidegger, because that is Carl Schmitt, who, if you have not heard of him, he was a Catholic sort of political theorist in Weimar Germany, who was arguing that, and it's sort of similar to how people misinterpret Popper's take on the paradox of tolerance, but he was arguing that basically the Weimar Republic could not allow like democratic legitimacy to groups who did not accept the premises of the Weimar Republic. And so he was arguing that regardless of election results, the president should exclude the far left and the far right, which both rejected the premises of Weimar, to power. And then, of course, Himmler appointed the winner of the most votes, who promised to hold new elections, Adolf Hitler, and we know how that went. And then Schmitt became one of the biggest defenders of the new regime. So he's sort of like Heidegger, but more so. But he's also, a lot of people on the left, like most of my books by Schmitt are by academic presses because his thinking has been really important. And so he, in this book, his best known book, The Concept of the Political, argues that basically the state, to operate as a state, and politics to operate as politics, needs to distinguish between friend and enemy. And the state needs to be able to designate internal enemies and to exclude them, including by force. And that is essentially, like, he didn't address, I don't think he ever addressed hate speech laws. I think he died before that was common. But I think probably like Bonald, he would have accepted the premise. But yeah, if the ideology of the managerial regime depends on this, which I want to make another video some point talking about, I think we were sort of de-Christianizing around the time of World War II. And so we ended up replacing a lot of Christian elements with sort of World War II mythology. So Hitler rebelling against the liberal order becomes Lucifer rebelling against God. Original sin becomes racism and all that. And it's sort of become part of the managerial order. And so the interesting thing about both of these people is that they were Catholic. And I think this is more of a common attitude towards Catholicism, which tends to favor sort of this idea of a corporate structure and doing what is better for the community in a way that is more universalistic. Like, a lot of societies are culturally collectivist, but not with the universalist sort of way that Catholicism is. And that is interesting because I wanted to talk about an essay by George Orwell called Prevention of Literature, which... So Orwell makes a few points in here. So one is that he says that what you can say ends up circumscribing what you can think, which interestingly, as I mentioned, I read Arendt, and that was what got me reading Schmitt. And I don't have her collection of essays, but I found it online. I was looking what she might have to say. And in her essay, Truth and Politics, she is citing Immanuel Kant, who says a very similar thing to Orwell here. So it circumscribes what you can think, and that is, I've experienced that myself, as I talked about in my video on evolutionary psychology. Once the red pill came along, people started hearing any Darwinian explanation for human behavior as, oh, that's the red pill. And then I felt like I had to go look up what the red pill was actually saying and explain it myself, and I got really tired of that, so I stopped explicitly testing out Darwinian explanations for why people might act in certain ways. And once I did that, I sort of ended up relying on what people were saying publicly, which were all hardcore environmentalist positions. And I ended up sort of operating on environmentalist assumptions, even though I am very much an interactionist, just because I didn't feel like I could talk about Darwinian explanations for human behavior publicly. But you could argue that this is more of a feature than a bug. Like, if you don't want people thinking the wrong thing, well, it's good that if people can't talk about things, you can't think them. To which I would say that I think that might work in some cases, but if you're trying to go too far outside of human nature or reality, what you're doing is you're fragilizing things, again, going back to Taleb. So you're making things seem smoother in the short term, but in the long term, you are just creating bigger risks of upheaval. And I'm going to have future videos on that topic, I think. But anyways, that was the first point Orwell raised. And then the next point Orwell made is that in a lot of these regimes, and he was focusing on communism and Catholicism, you are obliged to accept rapidly changing ideas of reality, which it's interesting because as I'm saying this, the Society of Pope Pius the X, which officially recognizes the power of the Pope, Vatican I, to speak infallibly, but in practice doesn't recognize the power of the Pope to enforce Vatican II that they theoretically recognize, and they got excommunicated. And so that is a case of the YouTuber Redeemed Zoomer likes referencing C.S. Lewis, saying that Catholicism requires you to commit not just to what the church has said, but to what it is going to say. And Catholicism is less extreme than communism in this regard, which is what Orwell focused on. But it is an issue, and it is something that people bring up a lot, is what is acceptable and normal changes rapidly. Like when I grew up, it was very much, we should all try to be colorblind, and now it's colorblindness is racism, right? That's just one example. There's been a bunch. I won't get into it because not really the main point. The point is about the idea in general. And then the last thing Orwell notes is that many critics of free speech distinguish between science and politics, but the two of them are indistinguishable. Like, you can't have free speech in one domain and not others. As Schmitt noted, and as Arendt noted in her essay, Truth and Politics, which is why I was like, oh yeah, I have this, I should finally read it. When you have power, especially power based on like democratic participation, everything becomes politicized. And so science becomes politicized, and philosophy potentially becomes politicized. This is something that, so I've talked a lot about Michael Polanyi's book, The Logic of Liberty. And one of the essays in here I haven't talked about is how Soviet Union, like Lysenkoism, like the Soviet policies on speech in general, didn't just apply to things that wouldn't seem to matter as much. They applied to basic agriculture and caused a famine. And I have talked about, again, the US government, which is democracy, but which is sort of based on the system Polanyi warned against, how we do like research funding now, putting its thumb on the scales of dietary science and teaching that it was fat that makes you fat and causes heart disease rather than starch and sugar. And I also mentioned I read Richard Rorty, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, recently. And at the very end of the chapter, so Rorty is basically arguing, and Orwell actually was too, and I didn't quite explain this well, I think, that when you don't have the freedom to explore every possible idea, it ends up being you're ruling out ideas that you wouldn't even think you're ruling out. And he was focusing on if you don't have philosophical freedom, you don't really have scientific freedom, which is sort of the inverse of Polanyi. But I think they're both true. And I have noticed the same thing, which is that when you stop thinking about and debating certain things, you're not just losing the things that you're trying to avoid talking about, or people are trying to sort of socially avoid talking about. You're losing a completely different perspective on the world, that you're going to see things differently. And I want to make more videos on perspectivism, probably make a whole playlist as I make more. But I've been thinking about, so Susan Sontag, in her essay on Simone Weil, she starts out talking about, and this isn't really the point, she goes in a different direction, but it was interesting to me. I'm going to do a reading of this on my second channel at some point, because it's a short essay. But she basically says, the people that we find interesting now are people who are, offensive and bigoted and out there. And she argues in this essay that it's because we find suffering and, suffering for your art, suffering for the truth, compelling, and we want this narrative of, the suffering artist. But I do think also the thing is, in order to actually, a lot of things, even if they might be only a small step in, outside of orthodoxy, and one that people might consider acceptable, getting there often requires considering things that we would find much more objectionable, which is why I've been trying to challenge a lot of my deeply held assumptions recently. And I was curious about Sontag because she was sort of writing at sort of the transition between the point when the consensus of the liberal establishment was a defense of free speech and when it became more, we should actually outlaw hate speech, although we can't in the US, but we should. So I was curious what her position was, and she defended Salman Rushdie, but also in her essay on the conscience of words, she acknowledges we're sort of moving from the individualistic take on things to a more collectivist one, and the idea of individual rights to group rights, and she doesn't speak either positively or negatively. And then after that, she basically goes, well, I care about justice and I care about truth, but if I have to choose one, and I hate to choose, but I'm going to have to choose truth, which is sort of consistent with, it doesn't really matter necessarily that she said this, but I was just curious about it. The main thing for me was her essay on Simone Weil. I was realizing, yeah, it does tend to be, because the whole thing I mentioned with evolutionary psychology, that only worked with me because I tend to try to be agreeable and get along with people and not just be like, yeah, this is true, or I think this is true, screw you if you don't agree, right? And so the people who actually do often make progress in this way are the people who don't care about what people think in general, including in terms of basic politeness and stuff. And so that basically it, but I had a couple of other things that I wanted to mention. One of them is Arendt, in her essay Truth in Politics, talks a lot about the idea that intellectuals should basically serve as a neutral arbiter, and that's what they're doing. But what we've seen now, of course, is that we are actually, the intelligentsia has become politicized, which is something that I've actually started reading this book fully, After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre, and I'm going to have a lot I want to say. Unfortunately, I didn't finish reading it in time to do this video, so I don't want to go too much into what he's saying, but he also brings up the fact that the idea that the managerial elite depends on this mythology, and he's focused on the mythology of competence, but he's also talking about the idea of sort of ethics, which I think is relevant to sort of these ideas of why most of the Western world has these hate speech restrictions. And so, all right, the last point I wanted to mention is that hate speech laws, they're supposedly about protecting vulnerable minorities, but they're not really, because they're about protecting the narrative and the power of the establishment. And so even though we don't have this direct reversal, Trump didn't make that happen, we do have a much more, I think, insidious reversal of, if you think about, especially the controversial hate speech cases, they are for people criticizing apparent failures of government where they're prosecuted for, no, they're condemning these groups of people, whether they are or not. Oh, yeah, so I think that's basically everything I wanted to cover. I had a lot, and doing this last minute, so I couldn't add, so I wrote a bunch of lists of everything I wanted to get. I think that's all of it. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. If you like this video, I have a bunch of playlists on my homepage now. If you want to support me, I have Ko-Fi and affiliate links in the description. So thanks for watching. Again, happy birthday, America, and I will see y'all in the next one.